In the middle of a brutal winter, when most people locked their doors and waited for the storm to pass, a broken veteran made one decision that would change everything. He didn't know the dog tied up in the snow had survived war. He didn't know powerful people were still hunting it. And he definitely didn't know that saving one forgotten K9 would pull him back from the edge he'd been standing on for months. What started as a single dollar in a blizzard would soon expose secrets, danger, and a bond strong enough to stop a man who had already lost his way. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Winter in Duluth, Minnesota was not a season so much as a condition imposed. The city clung to the western edge of Lake Superior like an old industrial scar, its streets sloping down toward frozen water that stretched endlessly beneath a low, colorless sky. By late January, daylight rarely felt complete. The sun rose without warmth, filtered through layers of gray cloud, and vanished long before anyone felt finished with the day. Snow no longer looked soft here. It compacted into dense granular layers along sidewalks and docks, hardened by weeks of wind and sub-zero nights. Even sound behaved differently in the cold. Engines growled lower, footsteps dulled. The lake, locked in ice, carried noise across miles and returned it distorted, as if the air itself resisted movement. 10 miles north of the city, back where streetlights thinned into darkness and the forest pressed close to the road, Ethan Cole lived in a small cedar cabin built for endurance, not comfort. The structure was plain and functional: one bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a mudroom barely wide enough to shed boots and coats, and a wood stove that ticked softly as it heated and cooled. Pine trees surrounded the clearing, their branches stiff and bowed beneath snow, standing so close that the cabin seemed sheltered and watched at the same time. The gravel driveway froze unevenly, turning into a patchwork of ice and ruts that demanded attention with every step. Ethan was 41 years old, compact and broad-shouldered, built like someone accustomed to carrying weight without complaint. He stood just under 6 feet, but his posture made him seem heavier, grounded. His hair was cut short in a practical military style that had grown slightly uneven at the edges, dark brown streaked faintly with gray near the temples. A narrow scar crossed his right eyebrow, pale against skin weathered by wind and cold. He kept his beard trimmed close, not out of vanity but habit, the sharp lines along his jaw giving his face a severe, controlled look. His eyes were hazel, flecked with green, and rarely still. They moved constantly, scanning, assessing, lingering briefly on doors, windows, and shadows, as if mapping exits without conscious effort. In town, Ethan worked part-time at a marina shop near the canal, repairing small engines and winterizing boats that would not touch water again until spring. The owner, Hank Marlowe, was a thick-set man in his late 50s with a steady voice and hands permanently stained with grease. Hank asked few questions. He paid fairly, respected silence, and recognized discipline when he saw it. Ethan valued that more than friendship. He arrived early, worked efficiently, spoke when necessary, and left before conversation drifted toward things he had no interest in explaining. 6 months earlier, Ethan had returned from Afghanistan with a duffel bag, a stack of discharge papers, and a silence that settled deep into his chest. He had been infantry before moving into a reconnaissance unit that operated along the edges of responsibility, where mistakes carried immediate consequences. A roadside explosion outside Kandahar had ended his last deployment in an instant. The blast left him concussed, his right shoulder permanently sensitive to cold, and his team shattered. 2 men died at the scene. Another survived with injuries severe enough to end his career. Ethan walked away physically intact enough to be discharged, but something essential had been disrupted, displaced. At night, the memories did not arrive in sequence. They came as sensations: pressure behind the eyes, the smell of burning rubber, the sudden tightening of his chest. The cabin, quiet and isolated, sometimes felt less like shelter and more like confinement. He could endure cold, hunger, pain. What he struggled with was stillness, the moments when his body had no task and his thoughts were free to circle old ground. On the night everything shifted, the weather radio issued a blizzard warning in a calm, measured voice that did nothing to soften the words. Wind off Lake Superior stacked itself against the hills and rolled inland with force. Snow fell sideways, sharp and stinging, driven hard enough to obscure distance entirely. The temperature dropped well below zero, and the wind stripped heat faster than clothing could preserve it. Ethan should have stayed inside, he knew that. Instead, he put on his insulated boots, double-knotted the laces, and pulled on his olive parka, its fabric stiff from cold. He grabbed his keys, a flashlight, and nothing else. He did not carry a weapon. He did not plan for confrontation. He simply needed motion, needed to be somewhere other than inside his own head. His pickup truck struggled to warm as he drove onto the county road. The heater hummed, the windshield fogged briefly before clearing, and the wipers fought the snow in uneven arcs. While wind shoved the truck sideways without warning, forcing constant correction. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through white, and beyond that tunnel was nothing. No horizon, no landmarks, just the sensation of moving through an environment that did not care whether he passed through it safely. He drove without direction until the road bent toward a stretch of highway exposed to open land. That was when he noticed the light. Weak, flickering, yellow. It came from a gas station that should have been closed for the season, its sign tilted and half buried in drifted snow. The building sat back from the road, windows dark except for one corner where an aging bulb still burned. Ethan slowed and turned in without fully deciding to. The tires crunched over ice and gravel as he parked beneath the pump canopy. When he shut off the engine, the sudden silence felt heavy, filled immediately by the roar of wind tearing across metal and concrete. He remained in the cab for a moment, breath fogging the glass, then pushed the door open. The cold struck hard and immediate, flooding his lungs and tightening his jaw. He moved toward the building with his shoulders squared against the wind. Near the side wall, something shifted. At first, it looked like a dark mound of snow pressed against a metal post. Then it lifted its head. A German shepherd lay tied to the post with a length of frayed rope. The dog was large but emaciated, its frame sharply defined beneath a matted sable and tan coat crusted with ice. Its ribs showed clearly. One ear bore a jagged notch, torn long ago and healed poorly. The pads of its paws were cracked and raw, dark against the snow. Despite the cold, the dog did not whine or bark. It watched Ethan approach with a stillness that felt deliberate. What held Ethan's attention were the eyes. Amber gold, focused, tracking every movement of his hands and shoulders, not fearful, not aggressive, alert in a way that suggested training rather than instinct. A man emerged from the dark doorway, pulling his hood tighter. He was in his late 50s, heavy-set with a bloated face, flushed red from alcohol and cold. His beard was patchy and gray, his breath sour with liquor and cigarettes. He wore a stained yellow snowmobile suit that hung loosely from his frame, its fabric worn thin. "Dog's no good," the man shouted over the wind, voice rough. "Won't guard, won't bite, just sits there. $5 if you want him, otherwise he stays. Wolves will take care of it." Ethan stopped several feet away. His body angled slightly, posture controlled. He didn't respond immediately. His gaze returned to the dog, to the tremor in its flank, and to a hairless patch on its right shoulder where scar tissue pulled the skin tight. Ethan recognized the pattern instantly. Shrapnel. He had seen it too many times to mistake it. He reached into his pocket and removed a $1 bill, folded and worn. He extended it without comment. The man hesitated only a moment before snatching it, muttering under his breath as he retreated back into the building. Ethan crouched slowly in front of the dog, careful with his movements. He did not reach out. He kept his voice low, steady. "All right," he said, not as a command, but as acknowledgement. He worked the knot loose with gloved fingers. When the rope slackened, the dog rose on stiff legs, favoring the scarred shoulder. It did not bolt. Instead, it stepped forward and leaned lightly against Ethan's shin, just enough to make contact, just enough to steady itself. Ethan felt something in his chest ease, barely perceptible, but real. He nodded once, accepting the unspoken agreement. He opened the passenger door of his truck, warm air spilling out into the storm, and guided the dog inside. As he closed the door and returned to the driver's seat, Ethan glanced once more at the station, then forward into the whiteout. He did not know the dog's name or its history. He only knew this: neither of them was going to be left in the storm tonight. The drive back to the cabin took longer than it should have. The storm thickened, compressing distance until the road felt shorter and more dangerous at the same time. Ethan kept both hands on the wheel, thumbs hooked lightly along the rim, correcting small slides without overreacting. The truck's heater pushed out air that smelled faintly of dust and warm metal. Beside him, the German Shepherd sat rigid in the passenger seat, body upright despite obvious fatigue. The dog did not curl up or shift to get comfortable. It faced forward, ears angled, eyes tracking the blurred sweep of the windshield wipers with focused intensity. Every few seconds, its gaze flicked sideways, not toward Ethan's face, but toward his hands, his shoulders, his breathing. The posture was familiar to Ethan in a way that settled uncomfortably deep. This wasn't a stray clinging to warmth. This was a working animal, maintaining situational awareness. When the truck turned off the county road and onto the narrow gravel drive, the dog stiffened further, muscles tightening beneath its matted coat. Ethan noticed but did not comment. He slowed deliberately, tires crunching over frozen ruts until the cabin came into view between the trees. A single porch light glowed dimly, haloed by blowing snow. He parked close to the mudroom door, killed the engine, and sat still for a moment. Silence rushed in, filled immediately by the wind tearing through the pines. The dog remained motionless, waiting. Ethan stepped out first, boots sinking into drifted snow. He opened the passenger door and moved back a step, giving space. The dog hesitated, then jumped down carefully, landing with a slight hitch as it favored the scarred shoulder. It did not bolt or circle. Instead, it stood close enough that Ethan could feel the heat radiating through the parka. The dog's size was more apparent now, likely 5 or 6 years old, full grown, but underfed enough that its frame showed sharp lines where muscle should have rounded. The coat, once thick and glossy, was dulled and tangled, ice clinging stubbornly along the belly and legs. Ethan led the way inside without looking back. The mudroom was small and dim, lit by a single bulb that flickered when the door shut. The air smelled of pine oil, damp wool, and old smoke from the stove. Ethan shrugged out of his parka and hung it on a hook, then kicked off his boots. He didn't tell the dog to sit. He didn't point. He simply moved farther into the cabin and waited. The dog followed at a measured pace, stopping just inside the threshold. It scanned the room quickly and efficiently, head turning in short, precise movements. The wood stove occupied one corner, radiating a low, steady heat. A narrow table stood against the wall, cluttered with mail and a flashlight. There were no photographs, no decorations beyond necessity. The cabin felt inhabited, but not personalized, as if Ethan had arranged it to meet requirements rather than comfort. Ethan retrieved a thick fleece blanket from the bedroom, originally meant for his own bed. He spread it on the floor near the stove, keeping his movements slow and predictable. When he finished, he stepped back and waited again. The dog's ears twitched. It looked from the blanket to Ethan, then back to the blanket. After a long moment, as it lowered itself carefully onto the fabric with a controlled exhale that trembled through its ribs. Even lying down, the dog kept its head up, eyes half-lidded but alert, watching the room. Ethan moved into the small kitchen alcove and opened a cabinet. He pulled out a can of premium dog food he kept for a neighbor's stray that occasionally wandered through in summer. He placed the bowl several feet from the blanket and filled a metal dish with water. He did not set them close. He did not encourage. Then he sat at the table, back straight, hands resting flat against the scarred wood. The dog did not move until Ethan settled fully. Only then did it rise, approach the bowl, and eat with careful restraint. It did not gorge. It took measured bites, pausing often to glance toward the door and then back to Ethan. Hunger, yes, but tempered by discipline. When it finished, it returned to the blanket without prompting and lay down again, body angled so that its line of sight covered both the door and Ethan's position at the table. Ethan watched quietly. He had spent years reading body language in men trained to hide weakness. The same principles applied here. This dog had learned that vigilance came before comfort, that trust was conditional and easily revoked. Whatever life it had lived before the gas station had reinforced those lessons brutally. Night settled in heavy and slow. The storm battered the cabin, wind rattling the roof and scratching branches against the siding. Ethan poured himself a glass of bourbon out of habit, set it on the table, and left it untouched. He stared at the wood stove as the fire shifted, casting uneven shadows across the walls. The dog remained still in the corner, breathing shallow but steady. Sometime after midnight, Ethan's hands began to tremble. The sensation crept in quietly, a tightening behind his eyes, a pressure in his chest that made it harder to draw breath. The room felt smaller. The firelight flickered too sharply. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening as the familiar disorientation took hold. Images surfaced uninvited: dust, heat, a sudden concussive force that stole sound and replaced it with ringing. He did not hear the dog move. He felt it, a solid weight pressed against his leg, firm and deliberate, not a jump, not a nudge. The dog leaned its flank into him, anchoring itself and, by extension, anchoring Ethan. Its head turned toward the door, ears pricked, body positioned as if assuming watch. The message was clear without words. The perimeter was covered. Ethan forced a breath, then another. He focused on the warmth through his jeans, the slow, steady rise and fall of the dog's ribcage against his thigh. The panic did not vanish, but it loosened, retreated enough for him to regain control. He lowered his hand to the edge of the chair, close enough to feel the dog's heat without touching. "I'm here," he whispered, voice rough. The dog did not respond, but its tail thumped once against the floor, a muted sound that felt like acknowledgement rather than affection. They stayed that way until the tremor passed. Ethan eventually leaned back in his chair, exhaustion replacing adrenaline. The dog returned to the blanket only after Ethan's breathing slowed, resuming its watchful posture without complaint. Morning arrived without ceremony. The sky lightened from black to a dull steel gray. The storm had moved on, leaving behind deep drifts and a silence that felt newly fragile. Ethan woke on the couch with a stiff neck and an unfamiliar absence. He had not woken in a sweat, had not gasped himself back into the present. He sat up slowly, joints aching from cold and sleep. The dog was no longer on the blanket. For a brief, sharp moment, concern flared. Then he saw it. The German shepherd lay on the bare floor near the front door, body stretched along the threshold like a barrier. Its fur was still damp in places, but its posture was relaxed in a way it hadn't been the night before. One ear flicked at the sound of Ethan's movement. The dog lifted its head, eyes alert but calm. Ethan stood and stretched, rolling his shoulder carefully. He studied the dog in the gray light, taking in details he had missed before. The intelligent set of the eyes, the scars that marked more than just injury, the way its breathing slowed when it realized Ethan was awake. "You need a name," Ethan said quietly. He wasn't sure why he spoke it aloud. Maybe saying it made the situation real. The dog tilted its head slightly, considering. Ethan glanced toward the window, where the pale morning light reflected off the snow beyond the trees. In the distance, Lake Superior lay hidden beneath cloud and ice, but he knew the lighthouses still stood along the shore, their beacons guiding ships through darkness and storm. "Beacon," he said. The word felt solid, practical. "That'll do." The dog rose carefully, favored shoulder and all, and released a low breath that might have been agreement. It stepped closer, stopping just short of contact this time, eyes steady on Ethan's face. Outside, the wind had eased. The world was still cold, still unforgiving. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. Ethan did not mistake it for healing. He knew better than that. What he recognized was alignment, the quiet understanding between two survivors who knew how to hold the line. The drive back to the cabin took longer than it should have. The storm thickened, compressing distance until the road felt shorter and more dangerous at the same time. Ethan kept both hands on the wheel, thumbs hooked lightly along the rim, correcting small slides without overreacting. The truck's heater pushed out air that smelled faintly of dust and warm metal. Beside him, the German shepherd sat rigid in the passenger seat, body upright despite obvious fatigue. The dog did not curl up or shift to get comfortable. It faced forward, ears angled, eyes tracking the blurred sweep of the windshield wipers with focused intensity. Every few seconds, its gaze flicked sideways, not toward Ethan's face, but toward his hands, his shoulders, his breathing. The posture was familiar to Ethan in a way that settled uncomfortably deep. This wasn't a stray clinging to warmth. This was a working animal maintaining situational awareness. When the truck turned off the county road and onto the narrow gravel drive, the dog stiffened further, muscles tightening beneath its matted coat. Ethan noticed but did not comment. He slowed deliberately, tires crunching over frozen ruts until the cabin came into view between the trees. A single porch light glowed dimly, haloed by blowing snow. He parked close to the mudroom door, killed the engine, and sat still for a moment. Silence rushed in, filled immediately by the wind tearing through the pines. The dog remained motionless, waiting. Ethan stepped out first, boots sinking into drifted snow. He opened the passenger door and moved back a step, giving space. The dog hesitated, then jumped down carefully, landing with a slight hitch as it favored the scarred shoulder. It did not bolt or circle. Instead, it stood close enough that Ethan could feel the heat radiating through the parka. The dog's size was more apparent now, likely 5 or 6 years old, full grown, but underfed enough that its frame showed sharp lines where muscle should have rounded. The coat, once thick and glossy, was dulled and tangled, ice clinging stubbornly along the belly and legs. Ethan led the way inside without looking back. The mudroom was small and dim, lit by a single bulb that flickered when the door shut. The air smelled of pine oil, damp wool, and old smoke from the stove. Ethan shrugged out of his parka and hung it on a hook, then kicked off his boots. He didn't tell the dog to sit. He didn't point. He simply moved farther into the cabin and waited. The dog followed at a measured pace, stopping just inside the threshold. It scanned the room quickly and efficiently, head turning in short, precise movements. The wood stove occupied one corner, radiating a low, steady heat. A narrow table stood against the wall, cluttered with mail and a flashlight. There were no photographs, no decorations beyond necessity. The cabin felt inhabited, but not personalized, as if Ethan had arranged it to meet requirements rather than comfort. Ethan retrieved a thick fleece blanket from the bedroom, originally meant for his own bed. He spread it on the floor near the stove, keeping his movements slow and predictable. When he finished, he stepped back and waited again. The dog's ears twitched. It looked from the blanket to Ethan, then back to the blanket. After a long moment, as it lowered itself carefully onto the fabric with a controlled exhale that trembled through its ribs. Even lying down, the dog kept its head up, eyes half-lidded but alert, watching the room. Ethan moved into the small kitchen alcove and opened a cabinet. He pulled out a can of premium dog food he kept for a neighbor's stray that occasionally wandered through in summer. He placed the bowl several feet from the blanket and filled a metal dish with water. He did not set them close. He did not encourage. Then he sat at the table, back straight, hands resting flat against the scarred wood. The dog did not move until Ethan settled fully. Only then did it rise, approach the bowl, and eat with careful restraint. It did not gorge. It took measured bites, pausing often to glance toward the door and then back to Ethan. Hunger. Yes, but tempered by discipline. When it finished, it returned to the blanket without prompting and lay down again, body angled so that its line of sight covered both the door and Ethan's position at the table. Ethan watched quietly. He had spent years reading body language in men trained to hide weakness. The same principles applied here. This dog had learned that vigilance came before comfort, that trust was conditional and easily revoked. Whatever life it had lived before the gas station had reinforced those lessons brutally. Night settled in heavy and slow. The storm battered the cabin, wind rattling the roof and scratching branches against the siding. Ethan poured himself a glass of bourbon out of habit, set it on the table, and left it untouched. He stared at the wood stove as the fire shifted, casting uneven shadows across the walls. The dog remained still in the corner, breathing shallow but steady. Sometime after midnight, Ethan's hands began to tremble. The sensation crept in quietly, a tightening behind his eyes, a pressure in his chest that made it harder to draw breath. The room felt smaller. The firelight flickered too sharply. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening as the familiar disorientation took hold. Images surfaced uninvited, dust, heat, a sudden concussive force that stole sound and replaced it with ringing. He did not hear the dog move. He felt it, a solid weight pressed against his leg, firm and deliberate, Not a jump, not a nudge. The dog leaned its flank into him, anchoring itself and, by extension, anchoring Ethan. Its head turned toward the door, ears pricked, body positioned as if assuming watch. The message was clear without words. The perimeter was covered. Ethan forced a breath, then another. He focused on the warmth through his jeans, the slow, steady rise and fall of the dog's ribcage against his thigh. The panic did not vanish, but it loosened, retreated enough for him to regain control. He lowered his hand to the edge of the chair, close enough to feel the dog's heat without touching. "I'm here," he whispered, voice rough. The dog did not respond, but its tail thumped once against the floor, a muted sound that felt like acknowledgement rather than affection. They stayed that way until the tremor passed. Ethan eventually leaned back in his chair, exhaustion replacing adrenaline. The dog returned to the blanket only after Ethan's breathing slowed, resuming its watchful posture without complaint. Morning arrived without ceremony. The sky lightened from black to a dull steel gray. The storm had moved on, leaving behind deep drifts and a silence that felt newly fragile. Ethan woke on the couch with a stiff neck and an unfamiliar absence. He had not woken in a sweat, had not gasped himself back into the present. He sat up slowly, joints aching from cold and sleep. The dog was no longer on the blanket. For a brief, sharp moment, concern flared. Then he saw it. The German shepherd lay on the bare floor near the front door, body stretched along the threshold like a barrier. Its fur was still damp in places, but its posture was relaxed in a way it hadn't been the night before. One ear flicked at the sound of Ethan's movement. The dog lifted its head, eyes alert but calm. Ethan stood and stretched, rolling his shoulder carefully. He studied the dog in the gray light, taking in details he had missed before. The intelligent set of the eyes, the scars that marked more than just injury, the way its breathing slowed when it realized Ethan was awake. "You need a name," Ethan said quietly. He wasn't sure why he spoke it aloud. Maybe saying it made the situation real. The dog tilted its head slightly, considering. Ethan glanced toward the window, where the pale morning light reflected off the snow beyond the trees. In the distance, Lake Superior lay hidden beneath cloud and ice, but he knew the lighthouses still stood along the shore, their beacons guiding ships through darkness and storm. "Beacon," he said. The word felt solid, practical. "That'll do." The dog rose carefully, favored shoulder and all, and released a low breath that might have been agreement. It stepped closer, stopping just short of contact this time, eyes steady on Ethan's face. Outside, the wind had eased. The world was still cold, still unforgiving. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. Ethan did not mistake it for healing. He knew better than that. What he recognized was alignment, the quiet understanding between two survivors who knew how to hold the line. Morning in the woods arrived without color. The sky above the pines lightened from charcoal to a flat metallic gray, and the snow reflected it back without mercy. Ethan shoveled the porch in steady, efficient strokes, the rhythm deliberate enough to keep his breathing even. Beacon stayed near the door, head low, ears tuned to the forest, tracking sounds Ethan couldn't hear. When Ethan slipped once on a patch of ice near the steps, Beacon moved instantly, planting his chest against the back of Ethan's legs just long enough to steady him, then stepped away as if nothing had happened. There was no excitement in it, no expectation of praise, just a correction. Ethan paused, resting on the shovel handle, and studied the dog anew. 5 or 6 years old, he guessed, old enough to have experience but not old enough to be worn down by time alone. The coat, once thick, was still recovering, dull and uneven, the ribs less sharp than the night before, but still visible. The scar on the shoulder pulled when Beacon shifted his weight, a reminder that some damage didn't announce itself loudly. Ethan had made a decision before finishing the porch. He didn't like the city, and he liked the idea of official paperwork even less, but ignoring what Beacon might need wasn't an option. He put the shovel away, pulled on his parka, and loaded the truck. Beacon climbed into the back seat this time without hesitation, turning once before settling with his body angled to keep Ethan in his peripheral vision through the rearview mirror. The drive toward Duluth felt different in daylight. Snowplows had carved narrow lanes through drifts. And the lake wind cut across open stretches with enough force to make the truck hum. Beacon watched everything: passing cars, pedestrians bundled into indistinct shapes, the flashing lights of a utility crew repairing a downed line with professional suspicion. The clinic sat on the edge of town where industrial buildings gave way to residential streets. Lakeside veterinary care was modern without being sterile. Glass and steel softened by wood accents meant to reassure anxious owners. Ethan parked, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then opened the door. Beacon hopped down carefully, favoring the shoulder but moving with purpose. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and damp wool. A bell chimed softly. The woman who met them at the counter introduced herself as Dr. Hannah Moore. She was in her late 30s, tall and lean, with straight dark hair pulled into a tight bun that emphasized high cheekbones and a calm, focused expression. Her skin was pale in a way that suggested she spent more time under fluorescent lights than sun, and her eyes, clear blue, steady, evaluated rather than judged. She wore a charcoal lab coat over a navy turtleneck, sleeves pushed back just enough to reveal hands that moved precisely, without wasted motion. People in the waiting room quieted slightly when she entered, not out of fear but respect. "That's quite a dog," she said, voice level, not reaching for baby talk. She crouched slowly, offering Beacon the back of her hand to sniff without advancing. Beacon did not approach. He assessed, ears flicking, eyes tracking her shoulders and hands. After a moment, he lowered his head a fraction. Permission, not trust. He's with me," Ethan said, and realized the words mattered. Hannah nodded once. "Good, let's take him to an exam room." Inside, the room was clean and warm, the stainless steel table padded and adjustable. Beacon did not like the table. His body stiffened when Hannah guided him up, nails scraping faintly as he shifted his weight. Ethan stood close, hand hovering near Beacon's flank without touching. Hannah noticed and adjusted her approach, speaking in low, even tones while she worked. She checked teeth, eyes, ears, noting dehydration, malnutrition, and the old injuries etched into muscle memory. When her fingers traced the scar on the shoulder, she paused. "That's shrapnel," she said quietly. "High-velocity fragment. He's been in a blast." Ethan exhaled through his nose. He had known, but hearing it named made the room feel smaller. Hannah reached for a scanner and passed it slowly over Beacon's neck. The device chirped faintly. She turned to a laptop on the counter, fingers moving with practiced speed as data loaded. The chip was damaged, partially corrupted, but not erased. A designation flickered onto the screen, followed by a status marker that made Hannah's jaw tighten. "Military," she said, "listed as missing in action. The data trail's thin, but it's there." Beacon stood still, eyes fixed on the door, body tense but controlled. Ethan felt the familiar pull of old anger, sharp and unhelpful. "What does that mean now?" he asked. "It means he didn't just wander off," Hannah replied. "Dogs like this don't get lost easily. Someone took him or kept him when he should have been recovered." She shut the laptop gently. "For today, he needs antibiotics, fluids, and rest. For the rest, we'll take it step by step." They left with a small kit, medication, instructions written in Hannah's precise hand, and a card with her direct number. Outside, the wind cut through the parking lot, but the sky had cleared enough to hint at blue. Beacon climbed back into the truck, posture easing slightly, the edge of suspicion dulled but not gone. They were halfway back to the cabin when Ethan's phone vibrated. He didn't recognize the number, but answered anyway. The voice on the other end belonged to Mark Reynolds, a former platoon sergeant who had transitioned into search and rescue work around the North Shore. Mark was in his mid-40s, tall and angular, with a beard that had gone iron gray early and eyes permanently narrowed from years of scanning terrain. The mountains had taken something from him once, a partner lost to a sudden slide, and the loss had sharpened him rather than softened him. "Cole," Mark said without preamble, "we've got a situation brewing up near the old logging trails. Storm knocked out comms. Family overdue." Ethan glanced at Beacon in the mirror. The dog's ears lifted at the change in his tone. "I'm not on any roster," Ethan said truthfully. "I know," Mark replied. "I'm not calling you for paperwork. I'm calling because you know that ground, and because I hear you've got a dog who might be useful." Ethan said nothing. Beacon shifted, pressing his body lightly against the seat as the truck hit a patch of rough road. The decision formed quietly, without the drama Ethan had once associated with choosing to act. "Send details," he said. Back at the cabin, Ethan organized gear with methodical care: thermal blankets, first aid kit, headlamps. Beacon watched, attentive, eyes tracking each item as if cataloging purpose. When Ethan finished, he knelt and met Beacon's gaze. "You lead," he said, not as a test, but an acknowledgement. Beacon rose, tail low but steady, and moved to the door. Outside, the forest waited, cold and indifferent. Ethan shouldered his pack, locked the cabin, and stepped into the snow beside the dog. The lines between past and present didn't vanish. They rarely did. But they sharpened into something usable, something that pointed forward. Whatever Beacon had been before, whatever he had endured, he was here now. And Ethan understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that some bonds weren't meant to fade. They were meant to hold. The medevac rotors faded into the low winter sky, leaving behind a quiet that felt heavier than the storm had. Ethan stood beside his truck at the edge of the landing zone, breath fogging in slow, controlled plumes. Snow settled again, light and deceptive, smoothing over the scars left by boots and skids as if the ground intended to erase evidence. Beacon shook once, sending a halo of ice crystals from his coat, then moved to Ethan's side without prompting. Up close, the dog looked spent, eyes dulled by fatigue, ribs still visible beneath fur that had begun to lift and fluff again with warmth and care. 5 or 6 years old, Ethan thought again, and already carrying more history than most men. Deputy Pike approached, pulling off his gloves. His beard was stiff with frost, and the lines around his eyes deepened when he smiled, rare, brief. "They'll make it," he said. "Kids especially. Your timing was the difference." Ethan nodded. Praise slid off him. Outcomes mattered more. Pike's gaze drifted to the tree line, where the snow still lay disturbed. "The man you saw," he added. "We'll look into it. Folks don't wander these woods dressed like that by accident." "I know," Ethan said. Beacon's ears tipped forward at the change in tone. Pike noticed and filed it away. Back at the cabin, Ethan moved through the familiar routine. Boots off, stove fed, water boiling, while Beacon drank deeply and settled near the heat. The dog's breathing slowed, muscles unclenching inch by inch. Ethan administered the antibiotics Hannah had given them, careful and quiet, and checked the shoulder again. The scar was old, angry in memory more than flesh, but it pulled when Beacon shifted. Ethan wrapped the area lightly, not to immobilize, but to protect, and Beacon accepted the touch with guarded tolerance. Trust was not yet automatic. It was negotiated, moment by moment. The knock came after dusk. Ethan's body reacted before his mind, posture straightening, weight shifting. Beacon rose without sound, placing himself between Ethan and the door, head level, eyes fixed. Ethan opened the door to reveal Mark Reynolds, snow clinging to his parka, beard rimmed with white. Mark's face looked carved rather than aged, cheekbones sharp, eyes alert. Years of rescue work had sanded him down to essentials. "They're stable," Mark said by way of greeting. "Hospital's optimistic." He glanced at Beacon, then back to Ethan. "Word spreading." "About the rescue," Ethan said. "About the dog," Mark replied. He stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. "I made a call. Quiet one. You need to know what you're sitting on." Mark laid out what he'd learned with the efficiency of someone used to bad news. A damaged chip wasn't unusual in blasts, but the secondary trail, commercial tags, erased transfers, was. Dogs with Beacon's training were assets, sometimes diverted by private operators when oversight blurred. The man in the woods, Caleb Voss, fit a profile Mark had seen before. Fixer, middleman, opportunist. Not the worst kind of evil, but persistent. Ethan listened, jaw set. Beacon stood still, tracking Mark's voice, posture attentive. When Mark finished, Ethan asked one question. "What do they want?" "Control," Mark said. "Or silence." The answer settled between them. Mark didn't push further. And he knew Ethan well enough to recognize the look, resolve without theatrics. "You're not alone," he added. "If this escalates, I'll bring in people who know how to keep it clean." After Mark left, the cabin felt smaller again. The quiet sharpened. Ethan poured water over grounds and made coffee he didn't need. Beacon lay near the stove, eyes half-lidded, but he wasn't sleeping. He was listening, cataloging the house as if committing it to memory. Ethan recognized the behavior from long nights in forward positions, how familiarity became defense. They didn't have long to wait. 2 days later, the city intruded. Ethan drove Beacon into Duluth for a follow-up with Hannah. The clinic was busier this time, the waiting room full of bundled owners and restless pets. Hannah greeted them with the same calm efficiency, noting Beacon's improved hydration and the clean healing around the shoulder. "He's responding well," she said, "mentally too." As if on cue, Beacon shifted closer to Ethan, leaning lightly, a habit now. Hannah's eyes flicked to the contact and softened. "That matters," she added. They were leaving when a man intercepted them near the door. He was well dressed for winter, tailored coat, polished boots, but out of place among parkas and wet fur. Late 40s, clean-shaven, hair cut short and deliberate. His eyes were pale and assessing, his smile practiced. "Mr. Cole," he said, voice smooth, "we should talk." Beacon stiffened instantly, placing his body between the man and Ethan. The man noticed, interest sharpening. "Caleb Voss," he offered, as if the name carried weight. "It doesn't," Ethan said. His voice stayed level. He didn't move Beacon aside. Voss raised his hand slightly. "No threats, just an offer. The dog's value exceeds your understanding. There are people who would pay to ensure he's handled properly." "Handled," Ethan repeated. "Managed," Voss corrected, and the word revealed him. "You could be compensated, relieved of responsibility." Beacon's low growl vibrated through the space, controlled and unmistakable. Owners nearby froze. Hannah stepped closer, presence firm. "You need to leave," she said. "Now." Voss's smile thinned. "Consider it," he said to Ethan, and backed away. He left without raising his voice, which worried Ethan more than bluster would have. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He secured the cabin, locks checked, lights timed, gear laid out with intention. Beacon followed each movement, mirroring patterns, assuming positions without instruction. They were a unit now, whether Ethan wanted the label or not. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Headlights cut through the trees just after midnight, stopping short of the drive. Footsteps crunched softly. Beacon alerted with a single huff, then went still. Ethan moved to the window, heart steady, mind clear. He saw Voss's silhouette and another behind him, smaller, nervous. Ethan stepped onto the porch, shotgun visible but lowered. He didn't aim it. He didn't need to. "Leave," he said. Voss tried one last angle, appeal, money, inevitability. Ethan listened, unmoved. Beacon stood at his side, posture unmistakable. When Voss stepped forward despite the warning, Beacon advanced a half-step, teeth bared, soundless. The line was clear. Sirens rose in the distance, Pike doing his job. Voss read the moment and retreated, melting back into the trees with a promise that rang hollow. The night swallowed them. When it was over, Ethan exhaled and felt the delayed tremor in his hands. Beacon leaned in, solid and warm, grounding him again. The danger hadn't vanished, but it had shape now, and shape could be countered. At dawn, Ethan loaded the truck and drove to town. He stopped at the hospital first. Daniel Ortiz looked better, color in his cheeks, eyes clear. Maya smiled shyly. Leo slept, breathing easy. Gratitude passed between men without ceremony. Outside, the lake lay quiet, steel gray and endless. Ethan knelt and rested his forehead briefly against Beacon's. "We're staying," he said. It wasn't defiance, it was commitment. They drove back to the cabin together, the road opening ahead. Being found had a price. Ethan intended to pay it on his own terms. The snowpack hardened overnight, the surface glazed by a thin crust that cracked underfoot like brittle glass. Ethan woke before dawn, not from panic this time, but from a habit older than the cabin itself. Beacon lay across the threshold again, a dark shape against the pale floor, breathing slow and even. When Ethan moved, the dog's ears twitched, eyes opening just enough to register position and intent. He didn't rise. He didn't need to. The house was quiet, the perimeter unchanged. Ethan dressed without turning on the lights. The stove still radiated a low heat, and the smell of yesterday's coffee lingered faintly. He stepped onto the porch and scanned the tree line. Snow had softened the tracks from the night before, but not erased them. Someone had stood there long enough to leave a print that spoke of waiting rather than passing through. Ethan memorized it and went back inside. By mid-morning, the knock came again. Firm, deliberate, daylight courteous. Beacon rose at once, posture tall but controlled, tail neutral. Ethan opened the door to Deputy Aaron Pike, his duster dusted white, beard trimmed clean today, eyes alert and unhurried. Pike's calm had been forged in seasons like this, and in an earlier life that taught him how quickly routine could become hazard. "I brought paperwork," Pike said, holding up a folder, "and coffee." Ethan stepped aside. Beacon stood between them until Pike crossed the threshold, then shifted back a half step, keeping both men in view. Pike noticed and approved without comment. He set the coffee down and opened the folder on the table. We filed an incident report for last night," he said. "Voss crossed a line. That gives us leverage." "Leverage runs out," Ethan replied. "Only if you stand alone," Pike said. He met Ethan's eyes. "You don't have to." They discussed options without dramatics: temporary relocation, protective custody for the dog, formalizing Beacon's status to limit claims. Each option came with a cost. Ethan weighed them with the same economy he applied to terrain. Moving would concede ground. Hiding would invite pursuit. Paperwork could help if it was clean. "There's someone you should meet," Pike said finally. "She's in town today." They drove to a municipal building near the waterfront where the lake's gray sheet pressed against concrete and steel. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of old files. Claire Whitaker waited in a small conference room. She stood when they entered, tall and spare, late 30s, hair cut blunt at the jawline and tucked behind her ears. Her suit was practical rather than fashionable, charcoal with a hint of wear at the cuffs. Her eyes were sharp and direct, the kind that read documents like maps. "I handle asset recovery and misuse cases," she said, offering a handshake that was firm without dominance. "Former prosecutor, I don't waste time." Beacon assessed her in silence. Claire acknowledged him with a nod, neither wary nor indulgent. "He's the reason I'm here," she added, "and the reason this can be done correctly." Claire laid out the landscape. Beacon's compromised chip and missing in action status created ambiguity. Ambiguity invited predators like Voss. The remedy was clarity. Formal recognition of Beacon as retired service K-9 under a therapeutic placement with Ethan as handler. It would take affidavits, medical evaluations, and a quiet federal signature. Not impossible. Not fast. "Voss will push while the window's open," Claire said. "He'll test boundaries." Beacon chose that moment to move closer to Ethan, resting his head lightly against Ethan's thigh. Claire watched the contact, then looked back to Ethan. "That bond," she said. "It matters. It's evidence." They left with a plan and a timeline. Outside, the wind cut hard along the water, but the sky had broken enough to show pale blue between clouds. Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not fear exactly, but readiness. He knew what came next. It came that evening. The cabin's power flickered once, twice, but then steadied. Beacon lifted his head. Ethan killed the lights and moved to the window. A vehicle idled beyond the tree line, engine low. Another figure approached on foot, careful, practiced. This one was not Voss. Nolan Pierce stepped into view, late 30s, compact, shoulders rolled forward as if he'd learned to keep his profile small. He wore a beard trimmed short, eyes hooded, movements efficient. The kind of man who had worked contracts and learned to leave no signature. He raised his hand slightly, palms out. "Ethan," Nolan called softly, "I'm not here to fight." Beacon's posture tightened, a warning held in check. Ethan opened the door just enough to speak. "State your business." Nolan swallowed, the gesture human and telling. "Voss hired me to talk," he said. "Not to take. I said no. I came to warn you." Ethan studied him. The wind tugged at Nolan's coat, revealing a scar along his forearm. Old, surgical, not an accident. "Why?" "Because I've been where your dog's been," Nolan said, "and I know how it ends if you don't draw a hard line." He explained quickly. Voss was escalating, shopping interest, leaning on contacts. The moment Beacon moved or vanished, it would become a chase no one wanted. Nolan had stepped away because he recognized the pattern and the cost. "You hold your ground," he said. "You make it public enough to be boring. Predators hate boring." Beacon eased forward, sniffed once, and retreated. Nolan took that as dismissal and relief. "That's all," he said. "Be careful." When he left, the woods swallowed him, as they had Voss. Ethan closed the door and leaned back against it, breath steady. Beacon pressed close, a silent question. We're not moving, Ethan said. We're fortifying. The next days blurred into preparation. Claire returned with documents. Hannah completed evaluations, noting Beacon's progress and recommending continued placement with Ethan. Pike coordinated patrols that were visible enough to deter but sparse enough to avoid provocation. Mark checked in with updates and supplies, each piece fit, a structure emerging from intent. Voss made one final attempt. He called, voice smooth, offering money that would have solved many problems. Ethan listened until the end, then said, "No," and ended the call. Beacon watched him, eyes steady. The letter arrived at dusk on the 5th day. Official. Heavy paper, Claire's name at the bottom, Beacon's status approved, effective immediately, temporary at first, renewable, lawful. Ethan sat at the table, leafy letter in hand, feeling the strange quiet that follows resolution. Outside, the wind had dropped. Snow fell straight down, gentle as ash. Beacon rose and placed his head under Ethan's hand, inviting contact. Ethan rested his palm there, fingers threading into warm fur. "We held," Ethan said, not to celebrate, but to mark the fact. Beacon's tail thumped once, solid and sure. They stepped onto the porch together and looked out at the woods. The line was not gone. It rarely was. But it was theirs now, defined, defended, and held. The weeks that followed did not arrive with drama. They arrived with routine, and that was how Ethan knew something fundamental had changed. Snowmelt carved narrow channels through the drifts, revealing dark seams of earth beneath the white. The days lengthened by minutes at a time, light lingering just enough to suggest the promise of movement. Beacon adjusted to the rhythm of the cabin as if he had always belonged there, positioning himself without instruction, resting when rest was permitted, rising when the perimeter required it. His coat thickened and lifted, the dullness fading into a healthier sheen. The scar on his shoulder still pulled, but it no longer dictated his gait. He carried himself like a professional who had learned to pace his strength. Ethan filled his mornings with structure. He ran the logging loop before dawn, and breath controlled, steps measured to avoid ice. Beacon ran alongside him, matching cadence, ears tuned to the forest's small sounds. When Ethan paused to stretch, Beacon scanned outward, a habit that had become mutual language. The nights grew quieter, the edges of Ethan's sleep smoothing. He still woke early, still scanned the dark, but the weight on his chest lifted enough to allow deeper breaths. The town noticed before Ethan did. At the marina, Hank watched Beacon lie calmly near the counter while Ethan worked, head up, eyes attentive but relaxed. "That dog's different," Hank said one afternoon, wiping his hands. "Not nervous, not needy, like he knows where he stands." Hank had lost a brother to a winter storm years back, a grief that made him gentle with other people's anchors. He nodded once at Beacon, a small gesture of respect. The first invitation arrived by email, then another by phone. A community meeting at the old civic hall near the waterfront, search and rescue volunteers, a few veterans, people who had heard about the rescue on the ridge and wanted to help. Ethan resisted the urge to decline. Avoidance had kept him alive once. It wouldn't build anything now. The hall smelled of coffee and damp coats. Folding chairs scraped softly against the floor. Beacon entered at Ethan's side, posture neutral, tail low and steady. Conversations dipped, then resumed. Lena Porter, a woman in her early 40s with cropped blonde hair and a wind-burned face, approached with an easy smile. She ran logistics for volunteer SAR efforts, the kind of person who kept lists in her head and expected follow-through. "You're Ethan," she said. "We're glad you came." Ethan nodded. He didn't like rooms, but Beacon stood calmly at his knee, grounding him. Lena introduced him to Tom Alvarez, mid-50s, stocky, mustache flecked with gray, a retired fire captain whose knee injury had ended his field days, but not his influence. Tom shook Ethan's hand with a firm grip. "We need training," he said, "not bravado, training." They talked without speeches. Needs emerged: basic winter navigation, canine handling protocols, mental health support for volunteers who carried more than they admitted. Ethan listened. Beacon lay down when the room settled, rising only when a door opened unexpectedly. People noticed the discipline, the absence of spectacle. A problem surfaced before the meeting ended. A young man named Evan Brooks, early 20s, restless energy coiled tight, stood to speak. His voice shook as he described a recent incident: a lost hiker, confusion, a volunteer panicking under pressure. "We didn't know what to do," Evan said. "We froze." Silence followed. Ethan felt the familiar urge to shrink from attention. Beacon stood, placing his shoulder against Ethan's leg, not to push him forward, but to remind him he was supported. Ethan spoke quietly. "Freezing happens," he said. "You plan for it. You build habits that carry you when your head can't." They agreed to a trial. Small, practical sessions, no fanfare. Lena would coordinate. Tom would secure space. Ethan would teach what he knew, with Beacon demonstrating what training looked like when it respected the animal and the handler. The first session took place on a windswept field near the harbor. The lake breathed cold air across the ice. Volunteers gathered in layers of wool and canvas, hands jammed into pockets. Ethan started with fundamentals: movement, spacing, voice control. Beacon demonstrated track work with patience, recalibrating when conditions changed. The dog was not flawless. He paused once, misread a drift, then corrected without prompting. Ethan highlighted the correction. "It's not about being right the first time," he said. "It's about recovering." Progress attracted attention. So did resistance. 2 nights later, a rock cracked the cabin window, the sound sharp and sudden. Beacon alerted instantly, body between Ethan and the breach. Outside, footsteps retreated into the trees. No note, no message. Ethan boarded the window and documented the damage. Pike arrived, jaw tight. "It's a warning," he said, "not Voss directly. Someone trying to rattle you." Ethan slept lightly that night. Beacon stayed close, posture protective but controlled. The threat did not escalate, but it did not vanish. Ethan weighed the cost of continuing. He also weighed the faces at the hall, the volunteers who had shown up despite fear. Claire called the next morning with an update. "We can formalize this," she said. "A small nonprofit, training and placement, transparency. It makes interference expensive." Ethan considered the word nonprofit, the weight of responsibility it implied. He thought of Beacon correcting himself on the drift, of Evan's trembling voice, of the quiet relief on Daniel Ortiz's face at the hospital. "Do it," he said. They named it simply, Northline, a marker rather than a boast. Paperwork followed. Hannah agreed to serve as veterinary advisor. Mark offered risk assessments. Lena handled schedules. Tom handled outreach. Ethan handled content. Beacon handled the rest. The second training session ran smoother. Evan froze again during a simulated search, breath hitching. Beacon approached, leaned in just enough, modeling steadiness. Evan mirrored the breathing, found his footing. The lesson landed without humiliation. Winter loosened its grip inch by inch. Snow fell less often. The lake showed dark water near the breakwall. The boarded window remained a reminder, but it no longer defined the days. Voss stayed silent. Nolan's warning echoed less loudly with each week that passed. One evening, after the last volunteer left and the field emptied, Ethan stood with Beacon at the edge of the harbor, the sky bruised purple and gold. Beacon sat, shoulder brushing Ethan's knee, and gaze fixed on the horizon. Ethan felt the old ache rise, then settle. Not gone. Managed. "We're not done," Ethan said, more observation than vow. Beacon's tail thumped once, measured and sure. The noise had faded. What remained was work. Quiet, necessary, and worth holding. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in increments, water tapping from eaves at noon, the crunch of ice softening into slush by afternoon, the lake shedding its grip along the breakwall in narrow, dark lanes. Ethan measured the change the way he measured everything else, by function. Roads reopened, trails held, people lingered outside longer without bracing. Beacon adjusted, shedding his winter coat in uneven tufts, the healthier fur beneath thick and clean. He was still 5 or 6 by Ethan's best estimate, still carrying the old scar at the shoulder, but his gait had smoothed, strength returning in a way that looked earned rather than forced. Northline found its footing quietly. No banners, no speeches, just schedules pinned to a corkboard and volunteers who showed up twice because the first time had helped. Lena Porter kept the calendar tight, her cropped blonde hair perpetually wind-tossed, her manner brisk without being cold. Tom Alvarez handled donors with a firefighter's candor, explaining needs plainly and refusing anything that came with strings. Hannah Moore volunteered her Saturdays, setting up basic canine health checks and teaching handlers how to read stress before it turned into injury. Mark Reynolds consulted from a distance, weighing risks and reminding Ethan to rest when he forgot. Beacon became the constant. He worked with economy, demonstrations short and precise, corrections gentle and timely. When Evan Brooks froze again during a night navigation drill, Beacon did not rush him. He sat, breathing slow, modeling calm. Evan found the rhythm and moved. The lesson landed because it wasn't dramatic, it was usable. The last shadow arrived without menace. Claire Whitaker called one afternoon, voice crisp. "Voss closed his shell," she said. "Investors scattered. He's not a problem anymore." No victory lap. Just confirmation that the line Ethan had drawn held beyond his sight. That evening, the lake lay flat and metallic, reflecting a sky stripped clean by wind. Ethan stood at the harbor's edge with Beacon seated at his side, posture relaxed, ears tracking distant gulls. The city hummed behind them, traffic, voices, the low grind of work returning. Ethan felt the old ache stir and settle the way it did now. Not erased, integrated. "You good?" Lena asked, approaching with Tom a step behind. She followed Ethan's gaze to the water. "We're setting the summer schedule tomorrow. Thought you should know." "I'll be there," Ethan said. He meant it. There they walked back toward the truck together, Beacon rising and falling into step, shoulder brushing Ethan's knee as if to confirm alignment. It wasn't a habit born of need anymore. It was choice. Weeks later, on a cool evening that smelled of whetstone and grass, Northline held a small open session by the field near the harbor. No press, just people. Families came, Daniel Ortiz among them, color restored, children clinging shyly to his legs. He shook Ethan's hand with gratitude that didn't demand response. Maya waved at Beacon, who acknowledged her with a dignified dip of the head. As dusk deepened, a single light flicked on at the edge of the field, then another. The city's glow softened, and the first stars broke through. Ethan found himself explaining breath control to a new volunteer when he felt Beacon shift. The dog rose, walked a few steps and sat facing north, posture intent but peaceful. Ethan followed his gaze. The brightest star of the evening hung steady above the lake, unblinking. He smiled despite himself. "Beacon," Tom said quietly, standing beside him. "Name fits." Ethan didn't answer. He knelt and rested his forearm along Beacon's back, feeling the solid warmth there, the slow confidence of a creature that had learned where to stand. The work would continue. The nights would still ask questions, but the answers no longer felt out of reach. When the field emptied and the lights went dark, Ethan locked the truck and drove home. The cabin welcomed them with familiar quiet. Beacon drank, circled once, and settled near the door, not guarding now, just present. Ethan sat at the table and wrote the next week's plan in a neat hand. Outside, and the woods breathed, patient and indifferent. Before turning in, Ethan stepped onto the porch. The sky was clear, stars sharp. He looked north again, then down at Beacon, who had followed without sound. "We keep going," Ethan said. Beacon's tail thumped once, steady as a heartbeat. The North Star held its place. The quiet held theirs. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire. They arrive quietly, through a wounded man who refuses to give up and a forgotten soul who was never meant to be abandoned. This story reminds us that God does not waste pain. What feels like the end is often the place where purpose begins. The struggles you carry today, the nights you think no one sees, they may be shaping you for someone else's survival tomorrow. In our everyday lives, we pass people and creatures who are tired, overlooked, or afraid. A single act of kindness, a moment of courage, a choice to stay instead of walking away. That may be the miracle God placed in your path. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story meant to you, or where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. And if you believe that no one should ever face darkness alone, please subscribe to this channel and join our community. May God bless you, protect you, and give you strength in your own battles. May He guide your steps, calm your fears, and remind you that even in the coldest moments, you are never forgotten. Amen.